Thank you for joining me tonight. I would like to share some of the stunning beauty of the Yukon and tell you about our 3-week paddle there. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement, which is a powerful way for non-Indigenous communities to show respect for and honor the Indigenous peoples of the land on which we live and work. The Hart and Peel River watersheds are not wilderness, but an ancestral homeland of the Tetlit Gwich'in, Trondak Hwechin, and Nacho Nyack Dune First Nations. In 1993, their elders negotiated a landmark treaty that covers both resources and culture. This agreement gave their nations self-governance and the basis to join with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness and the Yukon Conservation Societies to force the protection of the Peel River watershed. They fought for this all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and won. As of 2019, 83% of the Yukon portion of the Peel watershed is now protected. This area is larger than Banff and Yellowstone National Parks combined. For these elders, their work, the preservation of the land, and our access to it, I am grateful. The Peel River watershed is about 30,000 square miles and roughly 2/3 of the state of New York. You can see it here in this darker gray area. Most of the watershed is free of industrial development. Now, about the Gwich'in people, abbreviated from their social and cultural website, I will read a condensed version. We are one of the most northerly indigenous peoples on the North American continent, living at the northwestern limits of the boreal forest. Only the Inuit live further north. At the time of contact with Euro-Canadians, we lived in 9 different bands, with land stretching from the interior of Alaska through the Yukon and into the Mackenzie Valley. We now live primarily in 15 communities in the Yukon and Northwest Territories. We maintain close cultural and family ties, and together we total over 6,000 people. Many families still maintain summer and winter camps outside our communities. Hunting, fishing, and trapping remain important both culturally and economically, with caribou, moose, and whitefish being staples of our diet. So into this great land and history, we launch a 20-day canoe trip. And now our story, a little bit about what it takes, which is most importantly, a great group of people. Matt and Terry on the left from Naples, New York. Behind me, Isadora, our trip organizer and fearless leader from Hamilton, Ontario. Her paddling partner, Rob, from Ottawa. And Pamela, my paddling partner and life partner from Silver Spring, Maryland. 5 of us made photographs. We used 4 cell phone cameras, 3 GoPros, 2 high-end digital cameras, 2 point-and-shoot cameras, and Rob's drone. The photos are not in chronological order. And I do want to give special photo credit to Rob, who I think made the most beautiful landscapes of all of us. It takes a lot of gear, most of which is our own. We rented canoes and peripherals from an outfitter, and it takes a lot of food, 5 60-liter barrels to be precise. And finally, it takes significant logistical coordination with months of planning and preparation. We stayed overnight at Isadora's in Hamilton on our way to the Toronto airport, and Isadora's father generously arranged to schlep us to the airport using his van and a trailer loaded with our gear. So getting there, here we are looking down at the Rochester Museum and Science Center where we are now. We had a 150-mile drive to Toronto and then a 2,500-mile flight to Whitehorse, Yukon Territory. Whitehorse is near Skagway, Alaska, and has about 44,000 people from all over the world. It's a very international city. We spent 2 days and nights in an Airbnb in Whitehorse, doing our final provisioning, reviewing the rental gear with the outfitter, and final sorting on prepping of food. We then had a 250-mile van shuttle up north to the town of Mayo, from where we would catch our 63-mile bush plane flight to our put-in at Elliot Lake. Mayo is a town of about 450 or so, and this is its charming airport. This is the headquarters and control tower. This is the maintenance barn. Airport parking. Facilities, should you need relief. You can camp there before or after the trip for free and take a $5 shower if you choose in this building. Inside the headquarters and control tower is where you pay up for your final money owed on your flights. And this is what happens before you can load the plane. The big weigh-in. Total payload may not exceed 2,400 pounds for 6 people and 3 canoes. That leaves about 800 pounds per paddling team, including the paddlers, for their canoe, all of their gear, and food. The canoe weighs about 90 pounds, and you count it 1.5 times because it's on the pontoon, and that factors in the extra air resistance. So it can be tight, and if you're overweight, you have to leave things behind in the airport. It's especially difficult to pack light when you pack like I do. We were lucky. Once they weighed our gear and found it was well within expectations, they didn't make us gather into the cage and put us on the freight scale like they normally do. We watched the previous plane departing.
Woohoo!
Where is he?
Hart, here we come.
Hart, here we come.
Good.
This is kind of amazing because the pilot.
Yukon's out.
So, there we are. It's interesting watching the plane leave and your last contact with civilization disappear. But you can't dwell on that for long because there's lots of work to do. There's boats to be assembled. So the 2 boats on the left-hand side of the shore there, the furthest down, that's actually 2 boats, not 1. One is nested inside the other. They have to be pulled apart and one assembled. There is campsite to be found and things to be organized, but daylight is not a problem because it never gets dark. It's a team effort. We all pitch in. A few people assemble the canoe and some of us find camp. There's no real established campsite here. There's a few areas that may have been used before, but the Hart is not a heavily used river and we had to make do. Only a couple of parties had come down the river before us that year from what we understood. So this is our rain tarp / community center. Sometimes we put up screen sides with it as well for bug shelter, but not too often because the bugs weren't too terrible. And our first campsite. It was cool and rainy on and off. Probably 50s in the daytime and 40s at night. We did have frost one night. And this is a Google Earth animation that gives an overview of our route. You can see here leaving Elliot Lake, moving down Elliot Creek, very twisting and turning. It becomes very braided as well. This is where you can see Elliot Creek is ending, joining the Hart River. I'll pause here a second. It divides into many different braids, and you have to feel your way through in that you really can't see which is going to be best, and you just have to make your best guess and go with it. So we're about to paddle for the first day down the 15.5 miles of Elliot Creek, which may or may not be paddleable. The water's pretty shallow. It's fast moving and it's cold, probably around 45 degrees, but it could be a real slog. You can't start this too soon in the season because Elliot Lake might still have ice on it. And you can't wait too long either because the creek might dry up and there might not be enough water. So timing is critical, but not easy to predict. We actually heard one party was facing a 15-mile walk down the creek, not even dragging, and chose to get helicoptered out at great cost. So we were lucky. We didn't have too much of this to do. I've heard that to know if a relationship is strong enough to marry, a couple must take a canoe trip first. And we're off. Okay, we're good. No reason to go fast here. Just keep us to the left. Back paddle a little. We're good, that's good. All right, and now paddle a little harder and cut us. All right, draw. Draw. All right, there we go. Not as elegantly as we wanted, but we got through. I can attest to the fact that couples taking a canoe trip together is a great idea, that we're still together and planning a wedding. So now we're leaving Elliot Creek. We were very fortunate and had enough water and were able to paddle it in 2 days. And we're about to head down the Hart River for the next 155 miles. And then finally we'll be on the Peel River for the last 19 or so miles. You can't see around the corners, and that leaves you faced with the possibility of last-minute paddling to avoid things like sweepers. Sweepers are trees that are down across the river, and if you can't scout and you come around a corner and you see one, they can be very challenging. If you don't avoid them, they can knock you out of your boat, injure you, or at worst, trap and drown you. Sometimes you can get around them, and sometimes we had to cut them out of our way. You get the idea of the swiftness of the water and its power. So this is our campsite on day 7. We decided to call it an early day after having a close call with a sweeper that required navigating back upstream to go down the other side of a Y and choose a different branch, resulting in a swamped canoe and a lost paddle. But fortunately, we were able to retrieve the paddle. And then we were blessed with the first steady sunshine on day 7 and a double rainbow. We actually saw a number of full double rainbows on the trip. And then, after dinner, a moose! The only one we saw the whole trip. Now, we've read that the Hart River woodland caribou herd ranges across a good part of the watershed, but we did not see any of those, unfortunately. We also never saw a grizzly, although we know that they were there because we saw their footprints, and we always religiously carried our bear spray. There are also wolverines, wolves, lynx, and Dall sheep in the area, as well as eagles and peregrines, which we did see. So this is the speed of the Hart River without paddling. We figured it's about 10 kilometers an hour. Lunch spots and campsites were not difficult to come by, usually on gravel bars, and sometimes up in the woods. A group of 6 people in 3 tandems is a great choice of size. It's safer than smaller groups if something goes wrong, and it's also a good size for finding campsites. It makes for simpler logistics than larger groups with more tents. It's also a good size for consensus decision making and happens to be the most economical when it comes to dividing bush plane costs. So we would typically converse about when and where we wanted to stop. We had 13 campsites on 12 days of paddling, 6 rest and hike days, and 2 arrival and departure days for the 20 total. We could have done it in fewer days, but why would we? We went 190 miles of paddling, about 16 miles a day, ranging between 8 and 30 miles. It was a very flexible schedule. We back-timed from our target end date when the bush plane would be picking us up and decided by consensus whether or not to paddle or rest on any given day, depending on weather and available hikes and what we felt like doing. We were typically up at 8 or 9 in the morning and then on the river at 10 or 11. You can paddle these rivers with tripping companies, guided. We chose self-guided. Either way is fine. Guided is a little more luxurious. One of the favorite things to do was watch the light and the way it played in these mountains and valleys. Over the next 4 photographs, observe the difference of the same landscape taken in slightly different light. It was really a constant light show. These are some of the rock crenellations that we saw quite routinely on our paddle that look kind of like castles. And here's a Zen moment of just being here now, no distractions, no outside anything, just relaxation. We found some campsites by previous paddlers' notes or GPS waypoints. Most we just chose as we went along. We would do what I call campsite shopping. We'd look at a spot when we wanted to find a camp, and some of us or all of us would get out and start wandering around trying to check all the boxes. Is the site dry? Is there enough room? Is there firewood? Are there no bear prints? Does it have a great view? Now here's another good example of how the light played on the landscapes. Here's a typical lunch spot and a favorite campsite where we got to watch some peregrines playing around. We used the guidebook Wild Rivers of the Yukon's Peel Watershed by Yuri Pipra and Sarah Locke, which provided an invaluable description of the route and lots of other really interesting information. We also used notes and GPS waypoints from previous paddlers. Here's a condensed description from the guidebook. The Hart River is Class 2 overall, with 4 Class 3 rapids at medium or high water. We had medium water. The whitewater fun begins in earnest after you reach the Peel River. Expect fairly intense whitewater paddling, scouting, lining, and possibly a few liftovers or short portages. Powerful and high-volume currents, big ledges, holes, and thundering chutes merit your full attention. One long stretch of Class 3 water with Class 4 holes in midstream is followed by 2 long sets of demanding Class 3 rapids depending on water level. We used CalTopo for mapping and adding waypoints and notes and exporting files and maps for phone and GPS devices. We put in waypoints for possible campsites and hikes that others had recommended and for significant rapids to warn us in advance. So this is zoomed in now to our starting point at Elliot Lake. Here's one of the hikes that we had noted, and this turns out to be one that we did. And then later in here you can see where we have notes for rapids. And here's a really important one. This is where the bush plane is picking us up. We needed to know that exact location. We also printed and laminated maps, which is always a must. While phones have a friendlier user interface, they're more delicate and they use a lot more battery. So we relied mostly on the printed maps and the nearly bomb-proof Garmin devices. The InReach device on the left was used to send out a "We're OK" email via satellite to a group of contacts at the end of each day. We had 2 of these, which can also be used for two-way communication in an emergency. The larger GPS was used for navigation, finding waypoints like campsites, and knowing when significant rapids were up ahead. And the multiple power banks were used for charging cameras and GPS. So we knew about 2/3 of the way through the Hart River that it was going to get rougher, and we put on spray skirts, which protected the canoes from getting swamped in the larger rapids.
There's a nice line right there. It's a rock and roller. Here we go! Yeah! Yeah, baby!
Paddle.
All right, so we're gonna upriver ferry after we get through this, unless we can just punch through it. Okay, paddle like hell.
Next ledge. Paddle hard. Keep going.
All right, nicely done. Keep paddling hard. Yeah, baby. All right, we're fine. Yeah!
There's a really sharp drop here with very little water. Looks like we're gonna have to line this one. You can see roughly in the middle, or you can look at where the wave train is and that rock. But with those 2 reference points, kind of stay center left.
Here we go! Paddle, paddle, paddle. You're doing great, you're doing great. Got it, got it.
Straight forward, hard. Hard, hard, hard.
Yeah, here we go. Thank you.
I think the ones in there, the big ones, they're kind of tilted at an angle. I think that could roll you. Oh, yeah. Let's take a look at the one down there and make sure that one's actually doable.
Going. Okay, here we go. Are they eddied out or what? What is going on? Is that a ledge? All right, we're gonna go left of this stuff. We're gonna go straight down the middle. Don't hold the gunnels, don't hold the gunnels. All right, here we are back in the saddle again. Nice, warm, sunny August afternoon.
I'm glad you have a good attitude about it, dumping.
Well, yeah, you know, it's fine to dump. I don't mind dumping. It happens. I just don't want to dump in the beginning of a half-mile run of Class 3 whitewater.
I don't know what it is about whitewater that makes some of us want to yell like cowboys, but it just happens. This is our yard sale after dumping the boat. Not really. A yard sale is when everything scatters out throughout the river and you have to try and catch it and hope that you get it all. We didn't lose anything. It all stayed underneath the spray skirt. And inside the dry bags, everything remained dry. So our clothing and all that, we were very fortunate. Camp life was great. Lots of focus on food, including the grayling that Isadora loved to catch, but not clean. Matt cleaned all the fish, but Isa was all about the cooking and the presentation. We cooked on a twig stove as well as MSR white gas stoves and wood fires. We used cozies to conserve fuel. Some meals were fairly elaborate. That is quite a fire you got going there, Terry.
Awesome, thank you.
We're all warming our hands around it.
I lit the fire. Bob and I prepared the wood. she's only manipulating things over the fire.
So the spring roll gets in warm water for a minute till it gets thin. Put it on your plate, and then you fill it with lettuce, plum sauce, noodles, pork, seaweed, carrots, smoked tofu.
The most important meal of the day, of course, was cowboy coffee, first thing in the morning. Food was pretty varied, from pad thai, sometimes dessert, to chili, and a lot of baking in a reflector oven, from scones to biscuits and cornbread. We divided food by boat, so each team had 6 breakfasts and 6 meals to cook for the entire group, and then lunches were done on our own. We also had extra meals packed in case weather delayed the bush plane from picking us up for a day or more. Pancakes were on the menu. Someone who shall not be named chose not to bring a spatula with a kitchen kit, so Matt carved one out of a wood stirrer. And it worked great. A real winner of a breakfast. Isa is practicing the art of barrel diving. It always seems that the food you want has somehow settled to the very bottom. The kitchen counter, the kitchen stove, the oft-used kitchen oven. We spent a fair amount of time lounging in camp after all the work was done, enjoying the scenery and each other and the ever-changing light. We planned for taking multiple hikes, and they typically began around 3,000 foot of elevation. The mountains peaked at anywhere between 5 and 6,500 feet of elevation, but we typically gained less than 1,200 feet on a hike. The going was slow. There were no trails. It was all bushwhacking, sometimes beginning through bogs and thick forest spruce to get to open areas. The open areas looked really easy to hike from a distance. But when you got up close, the scree that looked smooth was wobbly and dangerous with deep holes between, plenty deep enough to twist an ankle or break a leg or even fall into in some cases. The moss was also challenging to walk on. This moss is incredibly thick and spongy, and this is how thick and spongy it is. That's about almost 18, 19, 20 inches. Woo-woo! Nice bedding. Nice bedding, but it also covered the scree so it could easily hide some of the dangerous holes. Forgive me, I can't help myself from doing this every time I see this photograph. The hills are alive with the sound of music. But seriously, the hikes were one of the absolute best aspects of the trip. And we were really blessed to have plenty of sunshine on the days that we were able to hike. This was my favorite hike, revealing this view. The rocks and mountains constantly amazed. There are so many different angles and types and kinds and shapes and colors of rock, all seemingly jumbled together inexplicably, like nowhere else I've ever been. And there's a great story behind this landscape. I've condensed and paraphrased it from the Wild Rivers of the Yukon's Peel Watershed guidebook. The oldest sediments in the Peel Watershed are roughly 2 billion years old, deposited when all of the Earth's land masses were clumped together in the supercontinent called Rodinia. Rodinia began to split apart about 750 million years ago, and the Pacific Ocean began to form between the separating land masses. The Earth's crustal plates continued to move across the surface of the planet. Powered by the fiery engine of the Earth's core heat, the plates travel at about the same rate that fingernails grow, about 2 to 5 centimeters per year. About 200 million years ago, the continental fragments began splitting apart and taking on the forms we recognize today. The northern Yukon was underwater at this time. Grain by grain, sediments built up until they were 5 to 25 kilometers thick. Mountain building began about 175 million years ago when North America began colliding with the oceanic plates off its west coast. The dense, heavy rock of the oceanic crust sank under the lighter layers of the continental sediments, lifting the sediments and forming hills and mountains along the edge of the continent. The ocean plate also acted as a conveyor belt, transporting volcanic islands and other chunks of land called terrains to the western edge of the continent. In a long, protracted series of collisions, the terrains plastered themselves against the edges of the continent. Terrains might be fragments of ocean floor, remnants of subterranean volcanoes, chains of offshore islands, or pieces of ancient continents. It was a messy undertaking. The continued pressure compressed thick layers of sedimentary rocks into folds. Stiff layers of limestone broke apart and were stacked on top of each other like pancakes. Older rocks were pushed over the top of younger ones, explaining why the Yukon's oldest rocks ended up high in the mountains. The continent continues drifting westward, forcing its way over the leading edge of the Pacific Ocean floor. This pressure is responsible for the high level of seismic activity in the Peel watershed, one of the most tectonically active parts of the Yukon. In 1940, a magnitude 6.5 earthquake rocked the mountains here. The beauty can also be appreciated in extreme close-up. Fireweed is the Yukon's territorial flower. It's a hardy plant and grows all over the Yukon from mid-July to September. This was after a fire in 2019. I've attempted to identify some of the plants we enjoyed. This is lichen, possibly British soldier lichen, crinkled snow lichen, northern reindeer lichen, Cladonia coccifera lichen, monk shood, Venus's chariot or wolf's bane, is a species of highly toxic flowering plant. Cloudberry. This one I couldn't identify. One-flowered cinquefoil. This Dr. Seussian-like flower seemed to be at every campsite and often in our food. It is Arctic cottongrass. Canoe tripping is physically renewing, emotionally refreshing, invigorating, sometimes competitive, fun, relaxing, and spiritually nourishing. But there's also laundry and bathing and rinsing and coiffing of various sorts and styles. Grooming came in various forms, sometimes with trepidation, and no one was exempt. By the last day on the river, you really know each other pretty well. The otter arrives to pick us up, piloted by our very able crew, piloting a very old plane, serial number 10, build date of February 20, 1953. It was reassuring that it was restored only 14 years ago. I found this sign very interesting, and there were plenty of mosquitoes to squash against the window. On our 19th night on the rivers, we met Micah from Berlin, the only other person we saw in the 20 days, out solo for 45 days in an inflatable canoe. We had dinner together and shared stories. We camped on the gravel bar together, and we invited him to join for coffee when he passed us the next morning because we had to get up much earlier than he would to meet our bush plane 1.5 miles down the river. So he did. He stopped by while we were there getting ready and had coffee with us and did a little fishing with Isadora. And finally he got ready to shove off and paddle on down the river. Now, can anyone see anything wrong with this picture? I'll give you a hint by going back to the previous one. He doesn't have his PFD on. We realized after he paddled away and was probably a mile or so down the river that his PFD was sitting on the gravel in front of us. So we were very concerned for his safety, and fortunately we were able to find a solution. Can you see anything wrong with this picture? That's his PFD outside the plane window. We had convinced the pilot that we should fly down the river, and if we spotted him, try and throw his PFD out and have him be able to retrieve it. And the pilot was game, and we found him, and the pilot threw it out the window. And as it turned out, we heard a few weeks later via email that he had in fact received it and was very grateful. Back at the Mayo Airport in the comfort of a service economy again, the lemonade and popcorn didn't last long. We camped overnight. It was our buffer travel safety day in case our bush plane had been delayed. The cost in US dollars for the trip was roughly $3,200 a person, all in. So if you took all of the shared expenses and divided them, that would be about $12,000, and divided it by the 6 people. And then you add on your flights from Toronto and some personal expenses, that's about what it cost, which was roughly $3,000 or a little more cheaper than if we had had a guided trip. Some people ask us why we do this. For each of us, there are different answers, but here are a few of what's in our hearts. We are seeking beauty and quiet and stillness, seeking the experience of being awestruck, wanting a bit more self-reliance, needing desperately a separation and disconnection from some aspects of modern life, desiring remoteness, needing intimacy with nature and creation, and wanting to participate inescapably in a very present, be here now lifestyle. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.